Good evening and welcome. Right. Welcome everyone and thank you for coming this evening. My name is Franz Burkhardt. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy here at King's. And it's a huge pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Our speaker, Ralston Saul, is one of Canada's leading public intellectuals and is perhaps best known for his philosophical trilogy of books, Voltaire's Bastards, The Doubter's Companion, and The Unconscious Civilization. John has received many awards for his writing, including the Pablo Neruda Medal and the Gutenberg Galaxy Award for Literature, and has been included in the Utne Reader's list of the world's 100 leading thinkers and visionaries. From 2009 to 2015, he was president of PEN International, the world's foremost association of writers, working to promote literature and to defend the freedom of expression around the globe. John has been a very prescient commentator on world affairs. He wrote about the subject of his talk this evening more than a decade ago in The Collapse of Globalism and the Reinvention of the World, a book that's surely worth rereading in the light of political and economic upheaval that we're witnessing today. So it's a huge honour to welcome John to King's this evening. It's also something of a homecoming for John because he's a former student of King's, having earned his PhD in the Department of War Studies in 1972. His doctorate, which was on the evolution of civil-military relations in France after the Algerian War, a copy of which was returned to the library on Tuesday. Thank you very much for that. And there's a story which you might hear about later. Also formed the basis for his first novel, Mort d'un Général, which was a sensation in France in 1976 when it was published. So King's is very much bound up in John's life and work, and we're delighted that his relationship with us is set to continue, with John recently being appointed as a visiting professor here at King's, based in the Policy Institute. We're very lucky to have him here tonight and to help shed light on some of the most pressing issues of the day. So please join me in welcoming John Ralston Saul.
Well, thank you very much, Franz, and it really is wonderful to be back at King's, having actually stolen, which is the right word, my PhD, in order to protect the sources named in it in 2 years after it went into the library, and only returned it after I think most of the people I was protecting have died, I would imagine. I felt I was a bit nervous coming back, actually, as a sort of maybe the only person who ever stole their PhD from their own university. But it was great fun, and the last 10 days have been amazing with Jonathan Grant and Jennifer Rubin and the Policy Institute, and talking to them about so many things that are happening here, working out how I can stay involved. So many thanks for that. And I want to do something else, just because I don't ever get a chance to do certain things. One of them is that, as it so happens, my very long time and now pretending to be retired literary agent, Mike Shaw, is sitting just up here. He's one of the great literary agents of London and internationally, and I'm just so thrilled to see him here. And also Toby Mundy. I don't know, where's Toby? There's Toby in the back row, very unusual for a great publisher and agent, who published The Collapse of Globalism. And between the two of them, I've had more fascinating conversations in London over the decades than I deserved, really. Let me say that, start by saying that I am a very strong believer in complexity as a reality of democracy in particular, but of any serious civilization. And complexity is not obscurantism, it's not inaccessible, it's not technocrats who can't talk to the public. It's something which the public is perfectly capable of dealing with, providing the leadership are intelligent and well-educated enough in a public way in order to engage in a conversation with the public. And so I think that necessity of public complexity is inextricably linked to citizenship. If you can't imagine citizens and complexity together, you don't deserve to live in a democracy. Which is why democracy is in a deep crisis today, because for the last 40 years, our elected and appointed elites in pretty well every Western country have not believed that it was possible to put the citizens together with complexity. And there are many reasons for that. I filled books like Voltaire's Bastards with analysis of how that happened, how reason went wrong, how they lost the understanding of ethics and the capacity to use ethics completely separately from rationality, et cetera, et cetera. And to say nothing of losing the capacity to imagine, which has always been one of the great tools of political and administrative leadership, and which, frankly, was squeezed after 1945, was certainly by 1960 squeezed out of public debate and to a great extent, public programming. And one of the results of that incapacity to function in democracies with complexity tied to citizenship, one of the direct outcomes of that is the return of populism. So you'll see I'm one of these people who goes back and forth. So this is where I'm getting, you know, if you look for the sources of populism, one of the great sources of populism is the loss of both capacity and flexibility and the capacity and rhetoric from what you might call the constituted elites. And it doesn't matter whether they're the right or the left. It's a pretty generalized problem throughout about, you know, the 30 or so standard democracies. And, you know, as a result of that rise of populism and return of what I called in the collapse of globalism negative nationalism, it came out in 2005, and I was looking for a way to explain what was happening in the world. And I knew that most of the constituted elites felt that nationalism was a bad thing, which is why it's back, because they couldn't deal with it. And of course, the history of nationalism is filled with great positives and great negatives. And they were not sophisticated enough, and I'm saying they, it's a very big generalization, there are exceptions, etc. They were not able to actually divide in their own minds what belonging and what I call positive nationalism was versus what I call negative nationalism, which leads to things like populism. So the end result today, frankly, is that we have incredibly confused constituted elites. I mean, Jonathan and I have been talking about that this week. The confusion in the elite structures of the Western world, of the democracies, is astonishing, whether it's administrative, private sector, or political. They don't know really what to do. And we are, in fact, living now in an era of confusion. I think the historians will look upon this as an era of intellectual confusion and policy confusion. So having started out with this searingly boring analysis, let me just say, let me put this in a much more direct way. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and I don't know if she's known at all in England, was the eldest daughter of Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, and the wife of the president of the House, or the chair of the House of Representatives. And she was the most terrifying hostess in Washington for about 50 years. She had the capacity with one-liners to destroy the reputations of presidents and vice presidents and politicians. And she said at one point, "Never trust a man who combs his hair straight up from his armpit." And it's a line which has never been truer and has implication not only in the United States, but in, you know, the populist leader of the opposition, if you like, in the Netherlands or many others. And she actually had another wonderful line, which I just have to use, which applies equally today. She was talking about, I think, Coolidge, and it's very true, again, about populists. She said, what is that? Somebody's gone. He sprang from the grassroots of the country clubs of America. And I think that's, again, very typical of so many of populist leaders. But that whole thing about the way you comb your hair is, you know, it sounds like a superficial insult, but actually it gets at the heart of a leadership problem tied to populism, which is that the most dangerous kind of elected leader, if you're looking for little simple hints of what to avoid, is a man or a woman with a bad inferiority complex. Because leaders with inferiority complexes are driven in a way which is deeply destructive. And you can just go through the last 40 years and pick out a whole series of people who fit that. And of course, somebody who combs their hair in a bizarre way is somebody who is deeply unconscious of themselves because they are so suffering and fear-filled that they cannot look in the mirror and see themselves. So they create this kind of 18th century ball gown version of a hairdo, which they think disguises who they really are. So I mean, these silly little things actually are the kinds of things that Socrates or Voltaire would have picked out and said, this tells you an enormous amount about why things don't function today. And Voltaire's filled with stuff like that. So let me walk back from simplification to the crisis that I think we're in, which we've been walking into since the mid-70s, which is about the time that we changed the basics of how we imagined that Western democracies and the world, since of course in the West we imagine that everything we do is what the world must do, how we started to reimagine or redeclare, I think would be a better way of saying it, ideologically, what needed to happen. We called it globalization. And you know, the West is very bizarre because we are a little bit like the person combing their hair up from the armpit. We come up with truths and declare them to be true, and they last about 40 years, and then they collapse, and of course people look back on them and say, well, that was just a silly ideology. And of course globalization is already perceivable as a silly ideology as it moves away, leaving a great deal of damage behind it. And you'll forgive the gross, I mean, I don't want to be up here an hour and a half, so, you know, you'll see all sorts of holes in my arguments. But, you know, if you actually wanted to summarize the theories that came out of, to a great extent, out of Vienna and ended up in the United States, and from there bounced back to England and were turned into a theory that took power from the mid-70s on, you could basically boil it down to the rebirth of a Midlands English mid-19th century theory of free trade, put together with a Midlands English mid-19th century theory of unregulated capitalism. That's essentially what it boils down to. A couple of Nobel Prizes that shouldn't have been given and so on. But, you know, what was so funny about it from the very beginning was that free trade in the middle of the 19th century in Britain was a left-of-center project filled with social policies and religious determination to bring justice to society. So the free trade that was produced in the 70s was completely the opposite of the free trade that was born in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. And the unregulated, the only way that it had to be, because the unregulated capitalism that was stuck with the free trade at the beginning of globalization was, of course, the arch enemy of free trade in the 19th century of Britain. So what these inventors of a brand new global theory did was they went and dug out of a drawer of dead waste two leftover theories of Britain in the middle of the 19th century, which were enemies of each other, and glued them together. So once you accept that very complete theory of mine, you'll understand that it was just a matter of time before the whole thing blew up. Does that mean that I'm making an argument against internationalism, against trade, against capitalism? Not at all. Not at all. There are many, many, many forms of internationalism. There always have been, and there always will be. And after all, I'm a writer published in 30 languages. I believe in international trade. What I don't believe in is an ideological, dried out, tired version of it put forward as a pretend postmodern solution to the world's needs. Anyway, this theory of this ideology of globalism could be seen by anybody who wanted to have a good look to be failing, not to be for or against, to be failing by 1995. If you track it, the high point of its power was 1995, and the failure of the International Agreement on Finance was the last great breakthrough of the ideology. And from then, it was like a sort of funny old bus going down a rickety old road with the mirrors falling off and the windows popping out and people holding onto their seats desperately and so on, to the point where you get to things like 2008 and so on. But I'm not here to give a long economic analysis, that's in The Collapse of Globalism and Voltaire's Bastards and so on. But the heart of the failure of globalization was its betrayal of the idea of citizenship, i.e. the idea of belonging, because people live somewhere and belong somewhere and identify with somewhere, and the idea of citizen responsibility, which we were told we weren't allowed to really have because the real power had moved elsewhere and couldn't be, we couldn't elect governments that could really deal with things because it was all beyond our borders. And of course, empathy, which lies at the heart of the idea of citizenship and belonging. So all of these things actually were shoved out the bus window with globalization. Well, they were saying, no, this is very good for democracy, and look, we've got a new democracy here, we have a new democracy here, there. But in reality, what was happening was that the capacity of citizens in democracies around the world were being weakened when it came to their ability to set policy and to give direction to their societies. So this is very interesting when you actually think about what's recently happened in Britain and how that actually happened and where that actually comes from. Because people are always separating things out and saying, well, that's Brexit, that's to do with Europe. No, that's to do with Latin America. No. But because they're not thinking internationally. In fact, the crisis in Europe and the crisis of refugees is completely linked to the failure of globalization and that ideology over the last 40 years, and its desperate desire to marginalize the power of citizens. So this idea of globalism, of borderless structures, of course we're all in favor of borderless structures to some extent, but this idea was not internationalism. It was really, again, you boil it down, a transfer of power from citizens to corporations. Some people benefited, some areas benefited, and some suffered. So if you say, look at what happened in the Rust Belt, then the other person says, yes, but look what happened in China. So I'm happy for what happened in China, to some extent. I'm a former president of Penn, so I'm not happy about what happened to freedom of expression and so. But you can't argue that you've come up with a revolutionary new theory which is global if the next thing you have to say is, well, yeah, but all that happened was it was cheaper to produce goods there, so the money went there and left here. Then that's not a new theory. That's just a 19th century theory. We're right back in the middle of the 19th century with the people who hated Robert Owen, basically saying we're going to cut the market at all possibilities. And we're right back in Adam Smith, where Adam Smith very, very clearly talked about what happens when you allow combines of large corporations. It's very interesting when you go into business schools, which dominate so many universities around the world today. I can tell you I've been in many, many business schools since I was the first one to really attack them in a systematic way. And so they now ask me back, now that they're not doing so well. And I have yet to find a senior person in a business school who's read Adam Smith through. They've read the comic book version with 2 or 3 quotes, and they don't actually know what he said about the need to regulate and control business. They simply don't know about that. Anyway, so this is the context in which it is very interesting to think about you, if you're British, complaining bitterly about the EU bureaucracy. Now, I'm actually on your side on that issue. I'm a pro-European who doesn't like the EU bureaucracy, and I can tell you one of the reasons that my wife and I, Aidan Clarkson, is sitting up there. We have 400 olive trees in Provence, and the bureaucrats in Brussels, a great center of expertise in olive oil production. are in the process of coming up with regulations which will ban the traditional means of pressing olive oil because it's not clean enough. It was good enough for 4,000, 5,000 years, not clean enough, and they're putting in place a machine which actually will not allow the production of the highest quality of olive oil. So I'm completely with you in terms of the bureaucracy, which has done some good things, but which is an explosion of unnecessary bureaucracy, and I'm going to come to why that happened and why it wasn't what was supposed to happen. But the interesting thing is that while the British voices were busy, whether they're political or journalistic or whatever, from the left or the right, were busy complaining about the encroaching bureaucracy of the EU and the removal of the independence of Britain, those same people at the very same time were actually abandoning large pieces of British capacity for citizenship and independence through international trade agreements and agreements of other sorts that came under the umbrella of globalization. So there was a complete lack of intellectual integration in terms of the British position almost from the beginning. And they were busy themselves, just as on the one hand they defended the Britishness, they were actually very busy undermining British citizenship through a series of international agreements, which again were not properly explained to the public. And so there was a great confusion, and it's still there, between the anger about Brussels versus the anger or pleasure about international economic agreements. And it was tied to I would say, if people were intelligent in the leadership, an intentional misunderstanding of the EU and a determination in Britain to say that this is an argument about, did we join a trade bloc or did we join a federation? And clearly, if that's the choice, that Manichaean choice, we joined a trade bloc. Of course, this was a false argument. It was never true. It was never meant to be true. And it was, and it led to a deep misunderstanding in the British public. So let me just go back to my PhD, which is I came to King's and I went to war studies and I did a PhD on Charles de Gaulle. And I wanted to do it on Charles de Gaulle, very strange, Anglophone, little Anglophone boy from Canada, because he was such an interesting figure, because he was the first one to rethink belonging and the possibility of a cultural idea of the nation state after the Second World War, under the incredibly menacing shadow of the United States. I'm not saying menacing in the sense there was a sort of atmosphere after the Second World War that you had to act within the shadow of the new Rome. And so the idea that there could be a concept of belonging and of citizenship and of culture elsewhere that really mattered in a primary way was not really at the front of the agenda. And it was de Gaulle who really rethought all of this. And of course, it was very difficult in London or New York or Toronto to understand how interesting he was, because the Anglophone press and the Anglophone political class decided that he was the enemy of light, that he was a 19th century romantic, horrible nationalist general and very dangerous, and was getting in our way, the way of the Anglos. So there was a relentless attack on him, right from the end of the war on, and of course once he became president it was completely out of control. He was demonized. He had many flaws. I'm a Canadian. He had many flaws, if you get that joke. But, you know, all politicians, all public figures, everybody has flaws, except for me and you know. But if you actually look at him, seriously, you see, first of all, that in 10 years he carried out a revolution modernizing France. Some of it I totally disagree with the way he did, some I totally agree with. Bringing in social policies, medical policies, fairness policies, as if he were actually a social democrat. He did more in 10 years than most leaders who were democratic elected have done in their lifetime. He was also, of course, a great writer, never mentioned in the Daily Telegraph. You know, he was one of the great stylists of French in the 20th century, the greatest modern Chateaubriand. I mean, the only man who could write military strategy as if he were a great novelist. You know, you have to be a great strategist. I mean, war studies people will probably agree with me on that. And he was constantly, since he was so bright and so educated, so civilized, as they would say, he was constantly imagining and reimagining complexity and flexibility, not just with little heart in military strategy, but in terms of governance and the multiple layers of being from a country and being from a continent. And that was the context in which de Gaulle, when he became president, reached out immediately to Adenauer. Adenauer didn't even want to come see him, because he thought, this great big old general is going to give me a very hard time as a German chancellor, you know? And he was forced to come almost immediately to see de Gaulle at Convent des Églises. And basically de Gaulle grabbed hold of him and said, we are going to build Europe together, you and me. We're going to make this work so that we never fight again. We're going to make Europe the most successful place in the world, you and me. And it's de Gaulle who led in the construction of Europe, whereas the Anglophone interpretation of de Gaulle was he was a nationalist who was against, you know, any kind of international things that limited him. And what I would recommend that you do is that you go to YouTube and look for de Gaulle's speeches in German in Germany, because he spoke fluent High German, because he'd been a prisoner for a year in Germany, I think in 1917, 18. And whereas he didn't like speaking English in public for political reasons, he spoke German often in Germany, gave great speeches, and as you know, his ego was rather great, and so he would not put on glasses in public. He had a totally photographic memory, and so you could watch him giving 15, 20-minute speeches in German without a note. It's just, and you watch the German crowds going crazy. And he's saying things like, the challenge, as always, is social and moral. We must come together to become better, freer, and to live with dignity. Or, the solidarity between our peoples is natural, but it must be organized. It must be lived. I mean, this is amazing stuff. This is stuff, we haven't heard people talk like that for 25 years in Western leadership. You know, and I'm just giving you simple things that he said. And he said it very, very beautifully and very elegantly. So when Britain was allowed, he was right to refuse Britain the first time, because you weren't it already, to actually play the game. But when you were invited in and allowed in, there was an enormous expectation, particularly from the French and the Germans, not that Britain would give up being Britain, but that Britain would become a brand new force for imagination and creativity in Europe, as de Gaulle and Adenauer had imagined it. And some of the people at the beginning really understood that. But of course, what actually happened was two things. One was that the brilliant and well-educated British technocracy rushed into Brussels and took as many spots as they could very effectively and grabbed every dollar they could grab and every bit of influence they could get, and were really the behind-the-scenes game Britain was incredibly effective at, even though people don't actually believe that. And the politicians gradually shrank away from talking about Europe in an interesting and imaginative way, so that the risk taken by the Germans and the French in bringing Britain in turned out to be a bad risk, because the British politicians fell back in saying, no, it's just a trade agreement. No, we don't want to do federalism. As opposed to saying, we're in the business of reimagining, not how to give up British sovereignty, but how to have multiple levels of belonging. And because they gave up that intellectual and imaginative leadership, that true democratic leadership of Europe, it basically all ratcheted down, because the leadership in Europe was also declining in quality very fast. And it ratcheted down to rather mediocre technocratic approaches, which of course led to the increasing removal of rights of sovereignty, because they didn't know what else to do, because they didn't have any ideas. So they just do what technocrats do when they're managing, which is to grab as much power as they can. So that, you know, people became increasingly happy, not just here, but all over Europe, and there's a growing crisis everywhere, and there's a rise of populism everywhere, and there's a furious public everywhere. And this public is furious about Europe, just in the same way that certain Americans are furious about the power structures in the United States, and so on and so on. This is all very, very linked. It's linked to the failure of globalism, of which the decline of Europe from a great Erasmusian, intellectual, imaginative, creative idea to a sort of management shop of trading either by bureaucrats or politicians, that's just part of the whole thing. And all the way along, as the confusion grew, the elites of various types have been unable to admit their failure because they didn't even really understand what their failure was. And that's what's really sad. I mean, it's really sad when you actually know your history, know what the idea was, the cultural idea of the EU, and then you see the failure, increasing failure of the leadership. And of course, they are, as I said, really very confused. Scott Fitzgerald said about American women, but I think about this as being about the technocratic leadership of the Western world, particularly Britain and Europe. The faces of most American women over 30 are the relief maps of petulant and bewildered unhappiness. I think that summarizes about where they are. They have no idea what to do. And as a result, the crisis is going to get better. So, get worse, rather. So let me go back to where I began again, which is, I said that I'm a great believer in the importance of public complexity tied to citizenship. Citizens are the source of legitimacy in democracies. Right? I mean, there shouldn't be an argument about that. It's not constitutions, it's not monarchs, citizens are the source of legitimacy. So that all stable regimes, this is true about. So that when we say the crown means the people. When we say the Constitution means the people. When we say the mandate of heaven, the Chinese concept, it means the people. And, if and the role of the monarch, with or without, the modern monarch, or the modern president, with the exception of France and the United States, or the emperor or head of China, is in fact, they are the protectors of the crown, which is to say of the people. It's not a very unusual constitutional theory I'm putting forward here. This has been said before. It's just usually not said with such, certainty and clarity. The crown is the people. The monarch has is in a position of authority to defend the crown. The prime minister is in a position of power to defend the crown, right? And the same thing is true in the United States, it's true in China. When the emperor or president of China does not defend the people properly, the mandate of heaven evaporates. And they wake up in a ditch or in a retirement home, if they're lucky. And so once you understand that, you begin to see why the way globalization was organized involved an intentional undermining of the citizens by using undemocratic means, that this approach was insulting to the dignity of citizens, that it ensured, once you knew that globalization was about undermining the people through as in the crown or the mandate of heaven, you knew that it would fail, because at a certain point the people get mad and they come back and slap you in the face. And first they slap you nicely, and then they slap you hard, and when they get really, really mad, they think of the worst thing they can possibly do, and that's to elect Donald Trump or Mrs. Le Pen or whatever. And we're in that period in the West where the population, the citizens are so mad that they're going to keep doing really angry things because haven't been listened to for 40 years. That's a gross simplification, but I think it stands up to examination. And you can see this happening from 1995 on, when it became clear how angry people were about the rising power of concepts of efficiency, which we talked about earlier today, which I've written a lot about. Efficiency is a third or fourth level shop floor characteristic. It's made to be something you do once you've decided on the ideas, on where you're going to go, how you're going to organize yourself, and then at the very end you hire some people to do some efficiency for you, some deliverables. And what globalization did in all its forms was to take this minor shop floor characteristic or talent and promote it gradually up to the very top, so that literally governments can't move without justifying the efficiency of their actions. This was never the intent of democracy. It is, that was the intent of fascism, but not of democracy. Democracy was always intended to be profoundly inefficient. That we would take our time, we would talk a lot, we would think about things, we would put stuff in place, and it would last because the citizens had given their sign-off on it through their representatives. And even in the days of rotten boroughs or the days of Chinese emperors, that sort of concept of responsibility versus deliverables was clear. And the loss of that and the rise of efficiency is one of the signs of the problem. Or, for example, how much is the phrase stakeholders used in Britain? Obviously. So when you hear somebody say, we're going to have a stakeholder meeting, you're talking about a phrase which is taken almost directly out of the collected philosophy of Benito Mussolini. Because the concept of corporatism, which I wrote about in The Unconscious Civilization, the concept of corporatism is we will replace democracy and citizens' obligations and rights with the idea that what really matters is what corporation do you belong to. And we will run the state through negotiations between the interest groups, between the stakeholders. So every time I'm sitting there and somebody says, this is a stakeholder meeting, I say, well, where are the people who actually don't have interests, like money or jobs involved? Where are the people, where are the citizens? Where are the people who are thinking about this? The concept of the stakeholder and stakeholder meeting is a profoundly anti-democratic idea, which comes out of the rise of the falsely rational specialist elites, and it's solidified by globalization, where you have specialist groups in silos who are managed, so that's vertical, and who are managed by a horizontal group of managers, and coming out of management schools. And of course, this what I've just described has no relationship to citizenship, has no relationship to ethics, has no relationship to democracy. And as we know, more and more universities are being shoved for financial reasons under the power of these management training groups, which are Mussolinian fundamentally. It's not that we don't need management, it's that you have to understand what proper roles are, what proper authority is. And to have the idea that society is led by managers is a contradiction in terms. How can you be led by a manager? That's not the job of a manager, to lead. And that, again, is what went wrong in the EU and what went wrong with globalization, and the extent to which you would see the promotion of, say, economics from a second or third level in public debate to the first level, so that everything had to pass through the little eye of economics in order to be justified, whether it was culture or social policy. And we began to use words like sick people were clients of hospitals. You're into a kind of delusional state of how things don't really work. And you fall gradually into a specialized technocracy. And so you can imagine what happened to Europe in that context, in which Britain was no better than France or Germany. No better. No worse, but no better. I often say that it was the rise of an idea of a society or a civilization which would be a society of form over content. And, because managerialism is form. And so content gradually declines, and the ability to deal with content declines. And the fear of public complexity declines. And one of the reasons it declines is because, democracy requires sophisticated rhetoric, humanist rhetoric, which has been around for an awfully long time, and it was gradually replaced by technocratic exposition and populist exposition, thereby losing the key role of rhetoric in the history of democracy. And that it is exactly in that context that it was not surprising to see the rise of referenda, not just in Britain, but throughout the Western democracies. And I'm not making a statement about who won and who lost. I just want to say to you what I said in Canada, where we had a couple of rather nervous ones, and I've said in France, which is, and many people have said this, I'm sure you must have heard it being said, the history of referenda is perfectly clear. They work with a population as a democratic tool up to about 50,000. So they work quite well in Athens. If you really make an effort, it can remain a democratic tool up to 1 million or 2. Beyond that, it is a profoundly anti-democratic tool, which was very happily used by people like Napoleon and other authoritarian figures in the 19th century, and picked up by people like Hitler and Mussolini. Why? Because, of course, they didn't want to deal with the complexity of the citizenship. So they got this lovely idea. We come up with one sentence, and we say to 25 or 50 million people, "You're so lucky. We love you. Here's a sentence. Now reply with one word of one syllable. You have a choice of 2 words. This is democracy. This is engaged citizenship. This is respect by the leaders for the source of legitimacy in the country, to reduce complex issues to one sentence, 2 single-syllable words." No wonder that anybody who knows anything about referendum say, "Don't do it. Don't go near it." And I mean, I remember just by pure chance finding myself with one of the key advisors to your last Prime Minister about 2 weeks before the Scottish referendum, and Jean Chrétien, who was the former Canadian Prime Minister who fought 2 referendum, one as the Cabinet Minister running it and the other as Prime Minister, and his principal advisor, we were at something and this senior advisor was there, and somebody pulled us over because at that point, you know, UK was losing the referendum, and said, "Maybe you could give some advice to this guy who will be speaking to the Prime Minister tonight." And we had this appalling conversation in which he basically was using the language of, well, you know, fear and economics. And Jean Chrétien, with all the politeness that he could muster, was trying to explain, it doesn't work that way. That's not what you do. You know, in the end, he basically said, at the end of the day, you will have to go to Scotland and get on your knees and say, "We love you. Don't go, because if you go, we will die." And in the end, he and the other party leaders went up there and more or less did that. But then at the end of the Brexit campaign, I saw the Prime Minister's last speech where he came out of the Parliament buildings and stood on a little platform and took his jacket off. When men wearing ties and white shirts take their jackets off as a sign of popularity or populism, it's really distressing. Because that means they don't understand at all. They're like the man with the funny haircut. I gave a speech which he thought was a speech of love, but which is in fact a speech of fear. And so you know, the outcome was the outcome. I would just say that I think that history will be very clear that your last Prime Minister will go down in history as the worst Prime Minister you've had since Lord North. And for those of you who know who Lord North was, he's the one who lost the 13 colonies. That's not because he is as dumb or didn't have some good ideas or didn't try. That's because you are judged as a leader for 2 things. How much did you improve in a serious way the public good? Did you, you know, public health care, justice? Did you do something to increase the public good? And then secondly, did you make any major failures? Everybody has minor failures, but major failures. And of course, once you know that you've had 2 major failures, because Scotland was a failure, and Brexit was a failure for him, and he didn't really change the country in any profoundly wonderful way, history will be very cruel. I could be wrong, but I don't see how it could go any other way. So all of what I'm describing produced a vacuum. Through that vacuum and confusion, populism rose. And, you know, Charles Clarke, you know, who was your Home Secretary and a very, very smart man, he must be because he's at King's, you know, said to me the other day, you know, the inability of systems to solve problems people can see. You know, that's when you know that you're in a period where there's no imagination functioning, where the leadership isn't properly functioning, and where, you know, you're handing power increasingly over to the haircombers, the populists, who are incredibly insecure and themselves are filled with fear. And because they're filled with fear and they're driven in politics, they have a talent for drawing out the fear in other people. And that's a classic description of the Napoleonic phenomenon, if you like, and which is exactly where we are. And a large part of that is the result of the death of what I would call complexity and complicated public rhetoric, which is supposed to be a conversation with the citizens, not with the other elites. So let me just, although I'm pretty close to when I should be sitting down, give you one or two examples of what I'm talking about. Let's talk about Spain. Because Britain did not take up its responsibility for imagining Europe with Germany and France, Spain stepped in and played an incredibly powerful role at the heart of the EU, and it's one of the reasons that there's a crisis today. But as you know, they went into a deep dive after 2008. And according to, and this is what, it's very important, you know, when the elites won't reform themselves, when they will not admit that they were wrong, when they will not change what they teach, you know you're in a crisis, which could be called a crisis of degeneracy. And so today, the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, they're all saying that Spain is making a comeback. There's a tiny bit of growth, there's a tiny bit of dropping in unemployment, and they're all trumpeting. There are some problems, but things are going so much better in Spain. So let me just do this very quickly. There's a tiny bit of growth, way below, you know, the economy is nowhere where it was before 2008. There have been very few reforms in the area of the real problems of corruption and so on, because nobody's asked for that. The unemployment is down from 26% to 19%. So that sounds reasonably, you know, if you think 19% is livable, sounds reasonably good. And youth unemployment is down from 55% to 48%. That's the reality in Spain. This sounds like a pre-revolutionary situation. But wait, so 80% of the population are statistically employed. This is the kind of stuff which everybody, all the elites are using to describe what's happening in the world today. 80% are employed. You look closer at the numbers, and you find out that 20% are of those, like, so let's leave 60, 20% have temporary employment, which means, you know, no protection, no pension, nothing. It's just like dock workers in the 19th century. And another 15% are part-time. Again, unstable, unprotected, etc. Labor. So the unemployment rate is probably somewhere around 37% if you do some divisions and so on. But on top of that, during this crisis, 1.8 million Spaniards and immigrants left the country. And most of those people, somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million, were the best educated. I'm looking at Carlos Turner, who's from Catalonia, who's the executive director of PEN International in London. He's nodding. You know, 1.8 million people left Spain and are not coming back. And at least 1 million to 1.5 million of them are people with PhDs and MAs, the finest people that they had in terms of future young people. So that's not included that the population of Spain dropped because so many young people actually left. And on top of that, the whole section of the population which simply walked away and stopped looking for jobs, and are perhaps doing some, you know, black labor jobs, you know, unannounced and unknown, or living with their parents, that number is not even counted. So we don't even know how many there are, but I can bet you, I don't know, Carlos, what do you think? 1 million? At least 1 million. So the numbers, when you look at it, are actually pre-revolutionary in Spain. But our elites, the same people who brought you the problems with Europe, our elites are saying, oh, no, Spain's making a recovery, isn't it wonderful? When in fact the exact opposite is happening. Let me give you another quick example. After 2008, one of the worst financial meltdowns in history, go into the departments of economics in universities around the world. And I haven't checked at King's, so I don't know. And ask the simple question. After 2008, did you reform what you taught? Did you change the curriculum? Because the curriculum was largely put in place in the 60s and 70s to favor the idea of globalization, deregulation, borderless, et cetera, et cetera. So, did you change it? And the answer is, largely, no. So they're still teaching the same failed theories that they taught all the way through globalization, even though we have an absolutely clear proof that it didn't work. Third example, debt. You know, we've gone through a period of the religion of the moral obligation to pay your debts, which is something I've never understood what religion had to do with debt. And debt's a contract. It's not there's no morality attached to it. And when I wrote Voltaire's Bastards, it came out in 1993, Africa was being ripped apart by the Western world because it couldn't pay its debts. And we were determined that we would lend them enough money so that they could pretend they were paying their debts. We went on doing it until we provoked the collapse of democracy in country after country, civil wars, destruction, poverty, etc. I mean, this was imposed. This destruction of progress in Africa was imposed by us in the West. I'm looking at a man who knows a lot about that. And I remember when the book came out, people almost falling off sidewalks when I said to them, what you do with the African debt is you rip it up. Just rip it up. I mean, there's lots of sophisticated ways of ripping it up. You say, let's get all the paper, and we get some very dignified senior bankers, and we get a desk, and they sit down, and they open the drawer, and they put all the debt papers in it, and then they seal the thing, and say, this is so important, we're going to open it in 100 years. It doesn't matter how you do it. You rip it up. Because history, again, going back to Athens, is perfectly clear. Solon came to power, I don't know how many of you know this, I'm sorry. Solon came to power. Athens was in a total disaster. Citizens could not pay their debts, so the bankers controlled them, which means they were no longer citizens. They couldn't vote because they couldn't pay the debts. And the whole democracy was falling apart. So Solon, the great poet, came to power. He did two things in 12 months. First of all, he ripped up the Draconian Code, because he didn't rip it up, it was in stone. But he ripped up the Draconian Code and put in the beginning of modern Western justice. It's a new system. And secondly, he, what they call, broke the chains, which is to say he ripped up the debt. And Britain, like France and Germany, claimed to be the inheritors of Greece and Rome. The French say it, the British just act as if it's true. And the Germans tried really hard to catch up in the late 19th century. So if Athens, the great democratic republic of Athens, was so important, surely it's important to realize that that entire project was built in that 1 year. It starts from Solon, really. It starts from the default on debts, Western civilization. And I could take you through the history of the West. Henry IV and his Minister of Finance, Sully, the greatest king they ever had, ripped up the debts. He called in the bankers and he said, gentlemen, I can't pay you. So I've got two possibilities. I can hang you or you can leave the country. And the third, of course, was they negotiated like 5 cents on the dollar or whatever. Louis XIV's ability to spend all that money to drive France into what would become a revolution, two kings on, was made possible by Henry IV's ripping up of the debts. The United States, between the Civil War in 1929, went through a series of booms where they put in infrastructure with European money, and when the debts got too high, they had a financial collapse, and the European companies were bankrupted, and the Americans kept the infrastructure. That's what you do. You rip up the debt. And we should have done that with Africa, but what's fascinating is that today, we're actually doing to ourselves what we did to Africa. That's what Western financial policy is. And so what I'm trying to show you is this incapacity to use history to think, to change direction, to do anything dramatic or interesting. And in 2008, this astonishing choice was made in the United States and still in Greece and in other places in Spain, which was to save the banks and not the people. An amazing choice. Because of course we have to save the banks or there'll be a depression. There were way too many banks. We could have easily had fewer banks. All they had to do was, say the United States, and it's announced one morning that every mortgage in the United States, don't do bureaucratic work on it. Every mortgage in the United States up to $300,000 is canceled. You can either put money into it or you just cancel it. What that would have done was remove the debt from the working class, the lower middle class, and a large part of the middle class. What that would have done was solidified those people in their houses, and since they were debt-free, they could go out and start spending and borrowing money. So you would have saved most of the banks, and you would have got yourself out of the crisis really fast. And instead of that, they gave it to the banks, and you know exactly what happened. This is the kind of thinking, that's what's happening with Greece. It's exactly where we are with Greece today, is this incapacity to say, instead of saying, if you clean up your act, we'll lend you more money, say, if you clean up your act, we'll rip up your debts. We would be in a totally different place if we'd had the imagination and the courage to do that, which is not what we've done. So let me close by going back again to the idea of citizenship. It has been undermined over 40 years in very sometimes subtle ways. I mean, one of the reasons that you see an explosion in those 40 years of NGOs is because young people who are now in their 40s and 50s and so on were basically told, why go into politics? There's no power in nation-state politics. So you see this explosion in NGOs in an attempt to influence the powers at the global level. But in the process, of course, you did the equivalent of what happened in Europe after the First World War, which is you hollowed out the political class. Because so many millions and millions of kids went into NGOs, which is an attempt to influence their enemies to whom they left power, as opposed to going into politics where they could simply pass laws. So where we are in the environmental debate, for example, would have been totally different if instead of going into NGOs, those kids had gone into politics. But they were convinced that no clean, bright young person goes into politics. Some did, of course. But the number who did was very, very small compared to what was possible. So this undermining of citizenship has been central to the various crises we're in, and it's central to the crisis of immigration, refugees, belonging, diversity, and citizenship, in which Europe and the United States and Australia are today. Because it's all part of that elite-driven weakening of the role of the citizen. And it has been deeply dishonest, frankly, when it comes to immigration and as a philosophy of civilization. Now, fabulous things are done in Britain on the question of refugees and immigrants and citizenship. I mean, so many people in Britain work on this issue. There are government policies. There are volunteer groups. I mean, this is the leading country in Europe. You're still there. The leading country in Europe in terms of dealing with immigration and citizenship in an intelligent and generous way. I have no doubt in my mind. And the Germans are catching up pretty fast. Because having taken in the 800,000 or 900,000, they had to immediately start throwing into place policies. And the volunteerism in Germany at the community level, as a result of the almost 1 million people coming in, is amazing. What's happening in those Germans? You know how the Germans have kept all those infrastructures and unions and so on. The volunteerism at the local level in Germany today is really, as I understand it, remarkable and admirable. And of course, if I had the power to give the Nobel Peace Prize last year, I would have given it to the Greek islands and the Italian Navy, because it's the people of the Greek islands and the Italian Navy who turned their back on their governments and on the EU and actually went out and saved lives without being asked for ethical reasons. So amazing things are happening in Britain and in Europe on this subject, but it is not focused, it is not clear, it is not intentional. And as a result, it's creating confusion. A lot of people who believe that they've been here a long time feel they're not being listened to. Same thing happened in the United States. To a great extent, that is because of the lack of leadership, the lack of rhetoric, the lack of complicated conversations in the society on these subjects. To put this very bluntly, since 1945, almost 75 years, every country in Western Europe, most, have been taking large numbers of immigrants and refugees every year. Cheap labor, refugees, people from the Commonwealth, the Empire, whatever, it doesn't matter. Every time there's a different explanation, there's a different sort of excuse, there's a different way of handling it. 75 years, at the end of which, the crisis in which we're in today, no country in Europe, including the UK, has a proper, conscious, integrated immigration and citizenship policy. Not one. I'm not saying, remember, I began by saying lots of great things are happening. Lots of great intentionality is there. But there is no, you'll forgive me, I haven't mentioned Canada once yet. So what we in Canada, a deeply flawed country that does many things wrong, so I'm not here to talk about that, but what we understand and a number of other countries understand to be an immigration and citizenship policy, in which you know what you're doing, you do it on purpose, and you know how you're going to handle it. And you invest in public infrastructures and in volunteerism in order to make it work. So this is sort of happening in Europe. Even in France it's happening. But it's happening in such a confused way, such a contradictory way, that of course many people who are in, I don't know where, Devon or something, and have never seen an immigrant, I'm just making this up, you know, they don't know what's happening, and they feel nervous, they feel upset, they feel threatened, and because there hasn't been a clear political, philosophical, rhetorical approach towards something which has been extremely positive and is very, very positive for Britain and for Germany and for France and so on. So there's no real policy, although Britain is moving towards one very, very slowly. Germany is crawling towards one very, very slowly. And secondly, because there is not a real integrated policy, there is no proper department of immigration and citizenship in any European country, including this country. Of course there's a department. It's a junior department under the Home Secretary. Now, people will deny what I'm about to say. The Home Secretary's principal purpose is order, police, and certainly since the Twin Towers, it's been increasingly about security. That is not the right place to put immigration and citizenship. It puts you down an intellectual road and an ethical road, which is the wrong road. You keep getting knocked off course about what's happening here. Why are people coming? What are they going to do? What are they going to be as citizens? And it's a junior ministry. You have to have you have to have a senior independent ministry of citizenship and immigration, which is at the same level as the Home Secretary and Foreign Affairs. That's what you need to have if you're going to bring in hundreds of thousands of people. You can't do it unless you organize it that way. And thirdly, as a result of that, you, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, have not created a large civil service of professionals who are in the business of immigration and citizenship. You put those three things together, and you have a very large part of the explanation for the discomfort of British subjects, citizens, and fear and confusion and not knowing what's going to happen next. And it's on all sides, in spite of all the great, great things that are happening. You know, I mentioned Canada a second time. We made a lot of mistakes. We're still making mistakes. But our immigration policy is 500 years old. It goes back to the indigenous peoples receiving the immigrants, you know, and for 250 years, it was basically an indigenous policy. And it gradually mutated, and then as we got stronger, we started mistreating indigenous peoples and pretending they never helped us, which we're now getting over. But the actual Ministry of Immigration and Citizenship was set up in, I think, 1870. You know, after that, there were some terrible moments of racism and exclusion and so on. But there's a policy, there's an idea, there's something that the citizens can debate, there's something that they can ask questions about. And one of the big problems here has been that, again, it's an elite problem, which is that you have, I've looked at the numbers, about half the people who come in are coming from the Commonwealth, the Empire, and a few other places. Those are immigrants. They're not migrants. And the words are really important. A migrant is somebody you want to get rid of. That's what the word means. An immigrant is coming to stay, and they're coming to become a citizen. Or the way I put it is, immigration is getting engaged, becoming a citizen is getting married. You know? And you have these citizenship ceremonies. A big public celebration is essential because it's the new citizens who want their very important decision to become British citizens celebrated publicly with their boss and their colleagues and their friends and their family. This is a very, very important thing. And the citizenship ceremonies, I haven't been to one here, but I would just guess that you could take them and double the length and bring in music and bring in kids and do really fun stuff and have a party. You have to spend money to really celebrate the fact that people have, you've invited them and they have decided to become one with you. Which doesn't mean you're not going to change and they're not going to change. But it means they've made a big, courageous, conscious decision to change their lives. And this needs a major public celebration where they get to say, I decided to become British and you decided to accept me and now we're going to work together and this is going to be wonderful. If you don't have that really big public celebration, you're missing one of the first major opportunities for people to feel that they belong. And you're also missing the opportunity for the people who are already here, who may have immigrated and become citizens, or may have been born here, may have been here 2,000, 3,000 years. You're missing a major opportunity for the people from here, to embrace in many, many different ways the people who are coming here. You have to create the mechanisms of that embrace between the people from here and the people coming here. And that has to be organized, as Charles de Gaulle said in 1960. It has to be organized. You have to tie immigration to citizenship as an intentional act. So the other half are Europeans. Many of them are going home. Many of them are kings or whatever, and they're coming here for 4 years or 5 years. So many of them are coming to make some money and leaving. Fine. Some of them are staying. And actually, one of the unintended consequences of Brexit, if it happens, is that a great number of them are going to stay. So I think that people who voted against Europeans coming here are about to get a very large number of new citizens, which I think you're very lucky to get. And that you have to celebrate that. You really have to embrace that and celebrate it in a very public way and find ways for people in Devon to be part of that, in a very physical and non-intellectual but complicated way. So I think that there's an enormous importance today for countries like Britain or Germany, to take two, to really focus on that immigration citizenship dynamic, to make sure that there is a clarity of purpose, which I think could be created here very fast and very easily, because most of the work is already being done, to make sure that there's a public philosophy which everybody can understand and be part of creating and buying into, in that process of ennobling the new citizen, by definition, you are re-ennobling the already citizen. These things go together. It's part of how these things function. I say this to somebody with my wife, co-chairs something called the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. We thought a lot about this and written a lot about it. This is not easy stuff. It is not easy. It requires intent. It requires public investment. It requires hours and hours of volunteer time. That's not charity. That's citizen engagement, volunteer time from citizens. So it's two halves: government policy, spending, and institutions, and volunteerism, engaged citizenship. Those are the two halves of what makes citizenship work, whether it's people born here or people who are coming here. And that has to be done aggressively, consciously, and enormous amounts of money have to be invested in order to make that really work. It isn't about values. Nobody even knows what the bloody word means. It's one of the most dangerous, slippery words around, because it can be used by Mr. Wilders as easily as it can be used by a nice person. But if you actually think about it, you look at what's the core of the society, the core of the history, the core of the experience of people. It's first belonging, its place, its geography, its culture, its climate. People in the south of France, when you go to their door, they come out. In Canada, they invite you in. It's climate. It's not very complicated, some of this stuff. Do you like rolling hills? Do you like the sea? This is stuff we're born with. This is very important. And you have to accept that belonging, that everybody is not made to be flexible in where they're going to work because of some global corporation. People live somewhere, and they want to be from that place. And people come, and very quickly they want to be from that place. Secondly, this incredibly important balance between citizens' rights and societal well-being, and then democratic systems and citizen engagement, which evolve over time, and then empathy and fairness. That's all you need to know. That's pretty well enough. And then you get on with the rest of it. So, and you have to accept a reality, which is that none of this is static. That's why rhetoric is so important. Because we're all being changed all the time. For God's sake, England was radically changed by Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Right? It would be silly to think that England was not changed radically by those things, and of course vice versa with less choice. The newcomers who come, if you organize yourself properly, it's already happening. They will be changed, but you'll be changed. I mean, the joke in London is, the moment when a particular Indian dish became the most popular dish in Britain. But that's it. It's like the haircut. That's a positive indicator of something that's happening. But you have to say, well, you can't just say, well, people want to come in here and change us. You also have to say, these people who are coming had the courage, the consciousness, and the decisiveness to want to change countries. Nobody wants to change their country. Right? You don't want to, they don't want it. They made this choice. The courage to change, the consciousness to change, the decisiveness to change. Those are three major characteristics of a good citizen that you're getting with people who come to this country and want to stay in this country. And I think we just have to say that we are changed, that they are changed, that we have multiple personalities. We always have had, and that German Westphalian idea of the nation state, which people in Britain deny they're influenced by, but are heavily influenced by, that it's the oneness of the place. Whereas in fact we all have multiple personalities. We're all more than one thing at once. But let me just finish with this, that the investment which is required in order for this idea of citizenship as the guarantee of legitimacy in a society, including the new people who come, involves spending enormous amounts of money on language classes, which I understand have been cut back on here, I believe. Enormous amounts of money on smaller classes, because you can't take kids who don't know a whole bunch of things about the country into large classes. Citizen sponsorship system, which is the third time I say Canada, which is a system we have in Canada, which I would really encourage. I think it's just starting here. And it's a way of drawing citizens in to immigration. And one of the really interesting things about citizen sponsorship is somebody from a farming village in Somerset can sponsor farmers to come from Syria and farm. They don't all have to come to London. They can go to places which are like the places they once lived in. Mentoring systems, there are a whole bunch of them in Britain. You just need to, whatever they are, add 2 zeros, And everybody here, if you're not helping to mentor immigrant kids, you're really not doing your job as British citizens. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, this is what you do when you invite people into your family. You go, you reach out to these kids, and the truth of the matter is, if they need it, they're going to get a great deal out of it, but I promise you, you're going to get more than they are. Because you're going to discover things in people you don't know. And from that comes the whole idea of political inclusion, joining political parties, corporations creating very, very complex and interesting diversity programs, which are not just about, we're not about charity, they're about fairness and about policies. And it's all, in the end of the day, about this balance between government and volunteers. And out of that comes the dignity of belonging, the dignity of justice, the dignity of fairness. If you stay with the failure of globalism, you'll get more negative nationalism, you'll get more fear, you'll get more anger, and you won't even understand where it's coming from, and the people who are angry won't even half the time understand what it's driving it. It's the absence of this integrated citizen conversation. But if it's positive nationalism, it's all about reconstruction of the idea of citizenship and commitment to the reality of citizenship and to the idea of the engaged citizen. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was a little over there, but anyway.
Good. We've got some time for questions and answers. Does anyone have any points they want to make? Over here.
Yeah, thanks very much for...
You have to shout a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very positive and fertile talk. You mentioned confusion among citizens a couple of times. What can be done about those in the current situation in Britain? I mean, given that there is a context of a press that emphasizes certain ideas, how can...
Well, I think that's what I tried to explain, was there's a lot of this has to do with rethinking education, It has to do with government policy, clarifying government policy, putting an intentionality into government policy around immigration and citizenship so that you get away from both the subtle negativisms of the globalist era and the refusal to organize what's happening anyway, which is immigration. You know, and to stop doing it in a piecemeal way and to actually create a kind of umbrella which both people who are already citizens and people who want to be citizens, everyone can understand it, and to set up, you know, government departments. And, you know, if you go, fourth or fifth time saying Canada, if you go to the Canadian High Commission in Delhi, it's the largest High Commission in Delhi, and over half the employees in it are specialists in immigration and citizenship. If you go to the German, you'll find, I don't know, 5 people. You know. So it's not realistic. You have to change that stuff.
Yeah, I want to take this off.
Good.
Yes, sorry. I want to take this off. Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to take your task on this issue of immigration. Canada is 3 times the size of the whole of Europe in landmass. You can take unlimited hundreds of thousands a year and it'll get lost in a vast area. I've been to Canada. You take 3 days to cross from one city to another. In Europe, Britain is a finite size. It's not going to get any bigger, and if we have global warming, it gets smaller because land will sink under the sea. We can't afford to take 300 to 400,000 net immigration every year indefinitely, and you talk about spending a lot of money on an immigration process. We, the taxpayer, have to pay for that, and I don't really wish to do so. A limited number of immigrants, yeah, maybe 50 to 60,000 people who are skilled, who we need, nucleus physicists and so on, from Europe perhaps, but vast numbers, millions, literally 1 million every 3 years, is going to cause massive social upheaval, as the Germans have discovered after letting 1 million people in a single year without thinking where they're going to house them. We have a housing crisis in this country. Of course we do. If you get bigger population with only a finite number of houses, you can have rocketing house prices, the young are never going to afford to buy a house, and you're just looking at it. Canada will never join the European Union. They're not stupid enough. The European Union is totally undemocratic. You say the populists are undemocratic. They submit themselves to election, whether you like them or not. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but he was elected by a fair election. But these people in Brussels are not elected by anybody. The Commission is unelected by anybody, just like the House of Lords in this country.
So,
answer those points, please.
So if I could just say, first of all, your opening line is the classic comment about Canada. Usually it's big, it's new, and something else. Well, first of all, something like 95% of immigrants go to 5 cities, which are as dense as anything in Europe. And no, because there are other people who are going to speak. And secondly, 3/4 of the Canadian landmass is inhabited by a very small number of people for very precise reasons, and is very unlikely to grow for very precise reasons, which have to do with climate, which have to do with geography, which have to do with the inability to live in those places. So that, in fact, the last thing you want is to be attempting to build cities as the Russians did in their north, with the incredible environmental damage that it required in order to make that possible. So the idea that Canada is big is simply a false argument. And, you know, I won't need to add the idea of it's not new, it's the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world, and the second or third oldest continuous democracy, but anyway, etc. So a lot of very serious choices have to be made. We take, at the moment, 320,000 a year, so every 3 years we're taking 1 million, which is what Germany did once. It's gone up and down over the years from 400,000 to 50,000. My point is, I already said what I said about the European bureaucracy, so you're just saying the same thing I said about the European bureaucracy. But the point is, you have to have a proper policy in order to decide what you're going to do. So if you decide, having created a proper policy, that the British people want, through a proper public discussion, which they all understand, to bring the number down to 50,000 and then try to figure out how to do it, that's your democratic right. But that's not what's happening, and that's not how it's been done, and that's my point. Okay? Yes?
At the top there, the lady here. Yes.
Hello. You haven't really explicitly
A little louder.
Sorry, can you hear me?
You need to switch it on.
This should be on now, all right. So you haven't really explicitly talked about redistribution and how this relates to the sense of belonging, because I thought...
Redistribution of what?
Redistribution of funds. So it's higher taxation and basically larger states, or perhaps a more social, democratic version of a state versus other forms and beliefs in small government. I kind of think this is entangled in this somehow.
You cannot think that?
It is entangled in the question of belonging to a place. So people probably are more likely to want to redistribute in a small group rather than in a country or in the EU or globally as well. So there is an equity issue as well. And I wondered whether how this relates to your notion of citizenship. So the question of redistribution and funding and people being unhappy about being left out financially as well and economically, which could have been fixed to some extent in those countries that are affected most by a more stronger policy on redistribution, which countries have decided against. And it has to do with citizenship as well and the sense of belonging, I suppose.
So just to answer one part of that very quickly, which is that those comments, which are perfectly good comments, I'm not criticizing them at all, leave out a very important element, which there are lots of actually quite good statistics on, but which because of the language in which they're presented, haven't made their way into the public debate properly, which is that there are, of course, costs to immigration, but there are enormous financial benefits to immigration, to say nothing of, how these aging populations of Europe and of Canada, I might add, are going to be totally reliant on immigrants to get through their old age. I mean, that's just the way the population line is going, unless it changes. But I'll just give you one example. We did a study at our institute as part of a program we have called 6 Degrees Citizen Space, which is a big annual meeting you might enjoy reading about or going to. We did a study of entrepreneurship. So this is wealth creation, right? And the studies all show, and the numbers come out of Statistics Canada, they're really quite interesting, all show that within 7 years of arrival, new Canadians are more likely to start up privately owned corporations of all sizes than people born in the country. So that the creativity and wealth creation coming out of immigration, I know that there are studies that have been done here. I know a guy here, I can't remember his name, who's done a study. It's not quite, they don't have quite the same numbers, but it's quite clear that privately owned corporations and small, medium, and large, maybe not large, but small, medium, and large, and immigration, citizenship are deeply linked. So that's one of the reasons why you've got, if you're going to do it, my point was, you're doing it anyway. And Sweden, I don't know where I hear, are you from here or Germany? You're doing it anyway, and you've been doing it since 1945. I mean, Germany started by taking all those Germans that hadn't lived in Germany for, 200-300 years or something. You're doing it anyway, but you're doing it without the necessary policies, not only to treat people with dignity, but the necessary policies to make it economically work. And in spite of that, there are many, many, many stories, even in the most difficult places like France, of the new citizens and the immigrants breaking through. But if you have the proper policies in place, and it's clear how it works, and it's easy for people to see how it works, you'll get a rise in the economic value that comes out of that. So you can't just take cost and taxes without putting in economic value. I can tell you, Canada would be economically an extremely poor place without what immigrants and new citizens are doing. And I just add to that one last thing, which is, if you have a clear policy, you'll have to deal with the things that fall off the edges always. But if you have a clear policy, then people who come, everyone knows that within, say, 5 years, they're going to be citizens. Once people know that, their whole attitude, many people's attitude would always be positive, but the attitude of people is, well, I'm going to be a citizen within 5 years. And that's not just voting, that's everything. That's everything, responsibilities, influence, and so on. And the clearer that is, another answer to what the gentleman was saying, which is, the statistics are clear. 85% of immigrants to Canada become citizens within 5 years. 85%. The number in the United States is 40%. And the number in Europe depends on the country, but some single digit, it's very low. The faster you get people into the mainstream of citizenship, the faster the economic benefits happen. The more you invest properly in schools. You know, remember, we all invested heavily in public schooling in Britain, in France, in Germany, in the 19th century for a very good reason. One was citizenship, and the other was economics. And as a result of investing in public education, there was an enormous creation of wealth. Well, it's still the same story. That's why smaller classes, extra programs, language classes. The faster you do all of that, the faster an immigrant can become an active citizen and an active economic contributor.
2 more questions, then we're going to go and have a drink. So, a question right at the back, and then we'll have one at the front. Yes.
Is that all right?
Thank you. Thanks for the lecture. Very interesting. Quick question about, I was reading an interesting book written by Mark Lilla. He's a political philosopher, and he wrote The Shipwrecked Mind. The Shipwrecked Mind.
Oh, yeah.
And his explanation about the current, let's say, populism is a desire to go back in time, to a longing towards a history, like Trump says, make America great again, which is referring to America was great at some point. And the same thing is happening in Europe. So my question to you is, your explanation for the current chaos is globalization and an attack on citizenship. Do you think that chimes with that other explanation of reactionism and a longing back to a history when everything was great?
Well, you know, I haven't read the book, so I can't judge it at all. But the way you've described it, I would call it a very minor thought theory inside something much larger. So that if you fail, if you undermine citizenship, if you remove dignity from citizens, if you tell people that their sense of belonging is secondary, and that what really matters is are they willing to change where they live, and that you're going to bring in a lot of people and you're not going to work out how they can work together with the new people, one of the things people will do, what he's describing as you described it, is the reactive phase of a much larger thing, which is what I was describing. Listen, a couple of years ago I was sitting at a Department of Economics in I don't know where it was, Florida or Louisiana, and it was a very famous Department of Economics for globalization, and we were seated at a kind of Soviet-like table, big square with about 50 economists and me as a sort of, potential prey, and they basically kept on saying again and again, but people have to be more flexible. I mean, they have to go to where the jobs are, etc. And so eventually I just said to them, look, so if you take this state and the 4 troubled states around you, it's about 40 million people. So what you're saying to me is 40 million people, let's say 35 or 30 million people, have to simply get up and go somewhere else because of your economic model. And I felt this sort of twitching around the room. I said, so how are you going to organize the moving of 30 to 35 million people? First of all, you're going to leave these states empty. Secondly, the value of their houses will collapse. Therefore, they will not have any money to buy a house anywhere else. I mean, is this really? And they don't have any answers to that because they just think that, this small group of people like me or you, we're on airplanes all the time, so shouldn't they all be on airplanes all the time? I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. That's not the way democracy works. That's not the way countries work. That's not the way belonging and identity works. That's where the lack of respect. You suddenly realize the lack of respect. But I remember years ago being on a plane. I don't know why I was in business class because I was quite young. Flying to Bangkok, where I used to go a lot, and coming out of somewhere, and there was a kid sitting next to me wearing a very expensive suit, which he never loosened the tie. And so eventually I had to say a few words to him. And I said, well, where are you going? And he was going, I think, to Indonesia. And I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I work for the World Bank, and I'm going to do the annual country report. And I said, gosh, that's very exciting. I mean, I guess you've been there many times. He said, no, I've never been there. And I said, well, oh gosh, really? So, I mean, you've read a lot of books about it. He said, no, I haven't read any books about it. But I have a briefing book. That is what has led to this. Or I remember being at, is it Johns Hopkins, which trains a lot of Latin American economists, And the head of the department came in to introduce me, not nearly as well as you did, or as nicely, and he looked very unhappy. And at the beginning he said, oh, I don't know what to say, you've got this long CV. And I said, well, why don't you just say the name of my book and say, as you did, without being prompted, he got the Pablo Neruda Medal. Because, of course, I'm deeply proud, as someone who can't write poetry, to get the Pablo Neruda Medal, right? Greatest poet in Spanish language, 20th century, maybe. And so I gave a speech which was more troubling than this one because it was all about globalization and the failure of, you know, the Washington Consensus and so on. And at the end, he said to me, you know, I didn't want to interfere, but I mean, you know, oh, sorry, when he introduced me, he put in this line about the Pablo Neruda Medal, but it was clear from the way he said it that he didn't know who Pablo Neruda was. It was absolutely clear. He had no idea who he was, right? And so he said at the end, I didn't want to disagree with you publicly, but you know, I was part of the IMF group that put together the economic models that we used in the 80s and so on in Latin America. So in other words, a guy who doesn't know who Pablo Neruda is designed the structures for Latin America, which of course were appalling failures. Not surprisingly, because he didn't know the difference between an abstract economic theory and real people living in real countries, which are very different from each other. Geography, education, race, whatever, you know, language.
Great. One last small question. Is there a small question? Yeah. Great.
Sorry, you can talk afterwards.
Is this on? So I just wanted to ask you about, you talked about the sort of failure of public institutions and people not wanting to go into politics and that kind of thing. When you think about citizenship, and I completely agree with everything you said about it, it was a great speech, but I would like you to just talk a bit more about what you think the public obligations of citizenship should be. I mean, when you're celebrating, what is it that we're celebrating that they're kind of coming to do? And I think one of the problems in this country we have is actually beyond sort of obeying the law, we have absolutely no obligations as a citizen at all, really, and perhaps that's because when the elites gave everyone a vote in the 1930s, they didn't really want them to take it up. But you know, do you think we should have compulsory voting and what else can we do? Because we do say to people, well, you've got to go and get a job. So, and again, to your point,
but we don't say you've got to go and be a citizen.
Participation is crucially important, but actually societal participation is kind of take it or leave it, and seems to be central to our problems.
Oh, I think it's a really great question. I've actually often struggled with the idea of compulsory voting because the Australians have it, and David Malouf, the great Australian novelist, is a good friend, and I remember he and I having debates in Australia and Canada about, because he says, and he's really smart, and he knows who Pablo Neruda is, and he would not make such a mistake. You know, he says that they made it obligatory. I think you're fined $200 or something, but it's actually become a party. Everybody goes in their families and they have picnics and they have a party. Now, it hasn't necessarily produced better governments, but you know, so be it. I don't know whether I'm in favor of that or not, but for example, there are programs that I don't know about here. I simply don't know, but there are programs that are growing in secondary schools in Canada. I mean, you have to be very careful about ordering citizens to do things. They are the guarantors of legitimacy.
We ordered them to go to school for 18 years, and yet I must tell you a story. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. I asked her why she was in favour of compulsory education when she wasn't in favour of compulsory voting. He said, because it's the root of everything. Well, there you go, exactly. What, is it voting not the root of everything in a democracy?
I mean, I don't dispute that. Or I do slightly, because I actually think voting is overrated in the sense that it's really grammar. Not grammar, it's really punctuation. What's interesting are the sentences, and the sentences leading to the exclamation mark and the question mark are citizen engagement. That's what makes the voting worthwhile. Just getting up once every 4 years and voting is a very lazy, and if it doesn't come as part of your engagement in the community, it's actually not, it's close to being referendum-style stuff, you know? But I do think that going along your line of obligatory schooling, I don't know how many of our provinces have done it. Certainly Ontario, the biggest, has, which is that in secondary school, there are a serious number of hours of obligatory volunteerism in order to graduate. Does that exist here? No. And, you know, if you'd asked me at the beginning, I would have said, what a crazy idea. You're about to ruin the reputation of volunteerism because you're forcing them to do it. But in fact, for the kids, it's a fabulous moment. A, they get to choose what they're going to volunteer at. B, they get to leave the school. And C, they get to meet a lot of interesting people and do some fun stuff. So in fact, it has become the roots of training for adult volunteerism. And the fact is that since volunteerism is not charity but citizenship, you really want to get people used to it when they don't have any money. So they can start saying, I'll do this when I've made enough money, the middle class excuse. That they actually do it before they even get in debt as students. They're already saying, yeah, but I go and work at a hospice, or, you know, I do this really great thing with immigrant kids, or I do this, or I do that. And something to boast about. You don't boast about your math marks, you know, but you boast about going and doing something really fun and interesting in the volunteer world. So I think there are things that can be built into the system which are about taking the concept of citizenship seriously without, you know, the elites trying to order people around, which will backfire. And then once you do, and also, sorry, it's the last thing that it's what is admired in society. If what's admired in society is anti-empathy competition, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's what's admired, doing the other guy in, doing better and trying not to pay taxes, I mean, you know, that whole list, going on holiday rather than helping. If that's what's admired, then you don't deserve the democracy you've got. But if what's admired is that you actually work with people, Shafiq here is Ismaili. Ismailis have a policy throughout the Ismaili community that part of being a very successful business community in Britain and in Canada, but, you know, the Aga Khan has made it absolutely clear, and the community has made it absolutely clear that you are not admired as an Ismaili unless you are a serious volunteer. And they volunteer way above the levels of pretty well everybody else in society. Just as a cultural, you know, as a cultural commitment. And I think that's the atmosphere that is so important to build. And it's not obligatory. It's really, it's really, how do you imagine being a citizen? Well, no, sorry. I know you're going to stop me, but I'll stop there. Being a citizen is empathy and responsibility.
So, John, I really want to thank you. Every time you start again, you put another record.
I know, I'm going to stop.
Actually, you want to be for hours and hours more, but you can't. There are some drinks waiting for us. So I really want to thank you. I just want to say three things. I mean, we've learned many things. There are three things I've learned today. One is that citizenship is hard work.
Yes.
The second is that citizenship is always in a reciprocal relationship with immigration, the experience of immigrants. It's the recreation of both, that it strengthens both, and that's a thing that we need to be thinking about. And the third thing, right at the end you mentioned again, is this importance of political imagination. And we must look forward to a time when there will be more imaginative political leaders again. Anyway, I want to really thank you for this fascinating and wonderful talk. After this, we're all going to go to Chapters, which is on the second floor. There's drinks, and we can talk for much longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.